The soup was cold by the time I finally sat down to eat it. That detail shouldn't matter. It's the kind of thing that gets lost in a story like mine, buried under bigger headlines and sharper moments. But I remember it clearly standing at my kitchen counter at 7 in the morning, reheating tomato soup from a can, watching the winter light come through the window above the sink, thinking about my granddaughter's birthday party the following weekend and whether I should bring flowers or just the gift. The soup was cold because I kept forgetting to eat it. I kept walking away from it to write things down in the yellow legal pad I'd started keeping on the kitchen table. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter. I'm 64 years old. I live alone in a house in Evanston, Illinois, that my wife and I bought in 1989 when the neighborhood still had a hardware store on every corner and the elm trees hadn't yet been taken down by disease. My wife, Carol, passed away 6 years ago, pancreatic cancer. She was gone in 4 months from the day of diagnosis, which people tell me was a mercy, though I've never quite agreed with that framing. I would have taken 4 years over 4 months. I would have taken anything over what we got. After Carol died, I sold the engineering consulting firm I'd built over 30 years. Not immediately. I held on for another 18 months, going through the motions, sitting in meetings where I couldn't remember what we were discussing, signing documents I'd read 3 times, without absorbing a single word. My business partner finally sat across from me one afternoon and said, quietly and without cruelty, that I wasn't really there anymore. He was right. We sold the firm to a larger company out of Houston, and I walked away with enough money that I would never need to think about money again. I don't say that to impress anyone. I say it because it's essential to understanding everything that came after. My son, Marcus, is 38. He has Carol's eyes and my stubbornness, which is a difficult combination. He works in commercial real estate, good at it, driven in the way that young men who grew up watching their fathers work long hours tend to be driven, trying to match something they saw early and internalized without fully understanding it. I'm proud of him. I've always been proud of him, even when we didn't speak for a year and a half, which I'll get to. Marcus married his wife, Diane, 7 years ago. The wedding was in June, outdoor ceremony at a vineyard in the Door County Peninsula, and I remember thinking she was sharp and funny and that she made my son laugh in a way that seemed entirely genuine. I liked her. I want to be clear about that. I liked her for a long time before things went wrong, and even now, even after everything, I don't think she was always the person she became. People change under pressure. They change when they're scared and when they're proud and when they've been told for too long that they're exceptional. Diane worked her way up through the hospitality industry. She had a talent for it, the logistics, the presentation, the way a room should feel when the right kind of people walked into it. By the time our trouble started, she was the floor manager at Carrington House, a restaurant in Chicago's River North neighborhood that had held 2 Michelin stars for 4 consecutive years. She ran that floor the way a general runs, a campaign precise, hierarchical, intolerant of error. Her staff were loyal to her or terrified of her. Sometimes both. Our grandchildren were Sophie, 7, and Owen, 5. They were the reason I kept reheating the soup and forgetting to eat it. I spent 3 afternoons a week with them while Marcus and Diane worked, picking Sophie up from school, collecting Owen from his preschool program, taking them to the park or the library or, on Fridays, to the diner 2 blocks from my house where the owner knew their names and always brought Owen an extra side of hash browns without being asked. Those afternoons were the best part of my week. They were, honestly, the best part of my life since Carol died. I noticed things, the way grandparents do. I noticed that Sophie's winter coat had a broken zipper that had been broken since October and still hadn't been replaced in December. I noticed that Owen's sneakers were worn through at the left toe, the rubber sole separating from the fabric in a way that let water in when we walked on wet sidewalks. I noticed that their school lunches, when I occasionally had reason to look, were thin, a sandwich, a piece of fruit, a small bag of crackers, not inadequate, but not generous. I didn't say anything at first. Marcus and Diane both worked. Things got busy. Costs added up. I understood. But then I noticed other things. I noticed that Diane had a new car, a German SUV, silver, the kind with a very long hood and a logo that glints in parking lot light. I noticed that she and Marcus had taken a long weekend in Miami that their neighbor mentioned casually over a fence conversation. I noticed that when I dropped the children home on Friday evenings, the refrigerator was often nearly empty, and Diane would order delivery rather than cook, and the delivery was always from restaurants I recognized as expensive. I kept these observations in the yellow legal pad, not because I was plotting anything, because I am an engineer by training, and engineers write things down. The afternoon everything changed, started as a normal one. It was a Thursday in late January. The temperature in Chicago had dropped to 11 degrees, with a wind chill that turned the walk from the parking garage to the school into something genuinely miserable. I was wearing my old wool coat, the navy blue one I'd had since the late 90s. Heavy and warm and slightly shapeless at this point. A watchman's coat, Carol used to call it. I was also wearing the boots I always wear in winter. Brown, unpolished, built for function rather than appearance. I had not shaved that morning because the water heater in my house had been making noises, and I'd spent the early part of the day on the phone with a plumber. I picked up Sophie and Owen, and we took the train into the city, which they loved. Owen pressed his face against the window the entire ride. Sophie read to him from a picture book she'd brought in her backpack, her finger tracing under the words with the focused effort of someone who has recently discovered they know how to do something important. We were not going to Carrington House. I want to be absolutely clear about that. We were going to a pizza place on Hubbard Street that Sophie had been requesting for 3 weeks. It was bright and loud, and they put your name on the marquee board when it was your birthday. And Sophie's birthday was in 11 days, and she wanted to see how it worked. The pizza place was unexpectedly closed, a water main issue, a handwritten sign on the door. Sophie stood on the sidewalk and looked at the sign with the specific devastation of a 7-year-old confronting an unjust universe. I told her we would find something just as good. Owen said he wanted the kind of pasta with the butter. I told him that was a reasonable request and that we would find it. We walked 2 blocks south, and there was Carrington House. I knew it was where Diane worked. It had simply not occurred to me that it would be a problem to take 2 young children inside for pasta with butter and whatever else they had on a Thursday at 5:30. We were not dressed for the room. I understood that the moment we walked through the door, the polished marble entry, the low amber lighting, the kind of quiet that expensive restaurants work hard to achieve. But I also knew that restaurants served food to people who were hungry, and I had 2 cold, disappointed children with me. And the hostess looked young and uncertain enough that I thought she might just seat us. She was seating us, actually. She had collected 3 menus and was turning toward the dining room when Diane appeared. I watched her see us. I watched the specific sequence of her expression recognition, something like surprise, and then something harder and more deliberate that replaced the surprise so quickly you might have missed it if you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. "Dad," she said. She called me that. She had always called me that, and it had always seemed genuine. This isn't really a good time. I told her we were just looking for dinner. I gestured at Sophie and Owen, who were standing next to me holding hands the way they did when they were in unfamiliar places. Diane smiled at the children. It was a practice smile, the kind she'd developed for the floor. "It's a busy service tonight," she said. "We're fully committed." The hostess looked at her menus, and then at me, and then at Diane, and said nothing. I told Diane it was fine, that we just needed a table for 3, that we would be out before the dinner rush. Her voice dropped slightly. Not enough that Sophie or Owen would notice, enough that I did. "Dad, I really need you to understand we have a certain kind of clientele here. It's a tasting menu format tonight. It's not really suitable for children. And honestly," and here she paused in a way that was almost imperceptible, "unless you were standing as close as I was, it might be a bit much for the budget. We can find you somewhere more appropriate." I looked at her for a moment. She was looking at my coat, at my boots, at the 2 children with the worn sneakers and the broken zipper. I told her that was fine, that we'd find somewhere else. And I took Sophie's hand and Owen's hand, and we walked back out through the polished marble entry into the 11-degree January air. Sophie looked up at me on the sidewalk. She said, "Is Mommy busy?" I told her yes. I told her Mommy was very busy tonight and that we were going to find the best pasta in Chicago instead. Owen said he still wanted the butter kind. I told him that was exactly what we were going to find. I found them pasta 4 blocks away at a family Italian place with red checked tablecloths and a basket of bread that arrived without being asked. Owen ate until he was silent with contentment. Sophie got her name on a small chalkboard near the register because I asked the owner if they did birthday recognitions, and he said they didn't but made an exception. She looked at her name in colored chalk and was satisfied. I drove them home. I reheated the soup I'd left on the counter that morning. I sat at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad, and I wrote down what had happened, and then I turned back through the previous pages, and I read everything I'd written over the past 4 months. I called my accountant the next morning. Not because of what Diane had said about the budget. I had not been offended on my own behalf. Not exactly. I called because of what I'd seen when I looked at Sophie's coat and Owen's sneakers while standing in that polished marble entry. I had seen them through Diane's eyes for just a moment, and what I'd seen there was not inconvenience or poor timing. What I'd seen was assessment. She had looked at her own children and calculated the impression they made. My accountant, a careful woman named Patricia who had worked with me since 1997, helped me understand several things over the following 3 weeks. She helped me understand that Marcus's salary was sufficient. She helped me understand that the household credit card statements, which Marcus had given me access to several years ago during a tax complication and never revoked, told a story of spending that did not align with broken zippers and worn-through sneakers. She helped me understand that the amounts attributed to Diane's work, wardrobe, personal care, and what appeared to be a personal account separate from the household account were not trivial. I want to be precise. I was not looking for a reason to condemn my daughter-in-law. I was looking for an explanation for the gap between what I'd observed and what I'd assumed, because in my experience, gaps that large have explanations, and the explanations matter. Patricia helped me understand the explanation. I sat with it for 2 weeks before I did anything else. During those 2 weeks, I bought Sophie a new winter coat. Purple, because she'd mentioned in October that she wanted a purple coat. I bought Owen new sneakers. I bought them quietly, as gifts, and I told Marcus they were early birthday presents. Marcus thanked me and didn't ask questions. He was not, I think, aware of everything that Patricia had shown me. That was its own kind of revelation. I also made a phone call to a man named Richard Hale. Richard and I had met in 1994 at a conference in Atlanta. We were both there for a real estate finance seminar that turned out to be less useful than advertised, and we'd ended up spending 2 evenings in the hotel bar talking about everything else. We'd stayed in loose contact for 30 years. Richard had gone into the hospitality business in the early 2000s and had done extremely well. He owned, among other things, the holding company that operated Carrington House. I had known this for several years. It had never seemed relevant before. Richard answered on the second ring and said my name like a man genuinely glad to hear it. We talked for 40 minutes, first about general things, and then I told him what I was thinking, and he listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Walter, I think you should come in for dinner." I told him I'd been turned away at the door. He said, "Not this time." What Richard and I discussed was not revenge. I want to be careful about how I describe it because the word revenge implies something hot and reactive, and what we planned was neither of those things. What we discussed was truth. Specifically, the mechanism by which certain truths about Diane's financial arrangements might become apparent to Marcus in a way that was clear, documented, and impossible to minimize. Richard had his own interest. He ran establishments where trust was foundational, trust between management and ownership, trust in the integrity of his staff. He'd had certain indicators about Carrington House that had concerned him for several months, and what I'd shared with Patricia had clarified some things he'd been trying to understand. We agreed on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks out. Richard would arrange for a reservation under my name. He would be present at the restaurant himself, which he occasionally was in his capacity as a general oversight visit, not unusual, not alarming. He would not announce himself in advance. I told Marcus I'd like to take him and Diane to dinner, a belated holiday celebration since we hadn't managed one in December. Marcus said that sounded great. He seemed genuinely pleased. He mentioned that he'd been hoping we'd spend some time together, the three of us, that things had felt scattered lately. I said yes. That was exactly what I thought too. I wore a jacket and tie. I had not worn a jacket and tie to dinner since Carol's last birthday, which she'd spent in the hospital, and which I'd dressed for anyway because she'd always appreciated the effort. The jacket was charcoal gray, the tie was a muted burgundy, and I'd had both for 20 years, so I was under no illusion that I cut a particularly fashionable figure. But I was clean, and my boots were polished, the same brown boots, but polished, and when I looked in the hallway mirror before leaving the house, I thought I looked like what I was, a 64-year-old man who had decided to wear a tie. I drove myself. Marcus and Diane were meeting me there. I arrived at Carrington House at 7:15. The same hostess was at the stand. She looked at me with a recognition that seemed uncertain. The face was familiar, but the context had shifted. I gave her my name. She found the reservation immediately. A table for 3, window side, the kind of placement that signaled a favored guest. The hostess led me to the table. I sat down and ordered a glass of water and looked out the window at the river, black and cold in the February dark, the bridge lights reflecting in broken patterns on the surface. I heard Diane before I saw her. Not her voice, her footsteps on the floor. The specific clip of her heels that I'd heard dozens of times on the tile of her own kitchen. I turned, and she was coming from the back of the restaurant toward the hostess stand, and her expression when she saw me, already seated at the window table, went through that same sequence I'd watched in January. Recognition, surprise, and then something else. But this time the something else was different. This time there was a calculation in it that I had not seen before, or perhaps had not been positioned to see. She recovered quickly. She was very good at recovering quickly. "Dad," she said, "you're early." I told her Marcus had texted to say he'd be 10 minutes behind. She nodded and sat across from me, and a server appeared immediately with the wine list, and she waved him toward me with the ease of someone who was accustomed to directing service rather than receiving it. We sat in a not uncomfortable silence for a moment. I told her that Owen had been asking about the pasta with butter, that he'd been talking about the Italian restaurant with the red check tablecloths and wondering if they could go back. She said that sounded fun. I told her that Sophie had been wearing her new purple coat to school, and that 3 of her classmates had told her it was beautiful, and that Sophie had reported this information at dinner with the careful composure of a person trying not to seem as pleased as she was. Diane smiled. It was a real smile, I thought. Whatever else was true, she loved her children. I had never doubted that. Marcus arrived at 7:22, windblown and apologetic, kissing Diane on the cheek and shaking my hand and asking if I'd looked at the menu yet. We ordered. The food was extraordinary, 3 courses of the kind of cooking that makes you understand why someone would give their professional life to it. We talked about Sophie's school play and Owen's obsession with a particular documentary about deep-sea fish and the real estate project Marcus was managing on the near west side. It was, I realized, the most comfortable dinner the 3 of us had had in years, and that made what came next harder, not easier. Richard appeared at our table at 9 to 10. He came from the direction of the kitchen, which was where he'd been for the last hour conducting the operational review his company did quarterly at each property. He was 61, trim, white-haired, wearing a suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit people who wear them often. He saw me, and his face did what the faces of old friends do, the particular brightness of genuine, uncomplicated pleasure. "Walter Marsh," he said. "It's been too long." I stood and we shook hands, and then he looked at Marcus and at Diane, and I introduced them. Marcus extended his hand warmly. Diane's expression had gone very still. I said, "Richard owns the group that operates this restaurant." Richard said something modest and accurate about the ownership structure. Then he looked at Diane and said, in the even, measured tone of a man who had been in difficult conversations his entire professional life, "Miss Calloway Diane, I believe we have some things to discuss. I've asked our regional HR director to join us. If you're available, I'd appreciate a few minutes in the private dining room." Marcus looked at Diane. Diane looked at Richard. Then, for just a moment, she looked at me. I did not look away. What happened in the private dining room, I wasn't present for. What I know from Marcus, who sat with me at the window table while it happened, and from Richard, who gave me a full account the following week. Over the preceding 3 weeks, Richard's team had conducted an internal audit of Carrington House's expense accounts, vendor relationships, and staff scheduling records. What Patricia had helped me see in the household finances had pointed towards something specific, a pattern of charges that ran through the restaurant's supplier network, small enough to evade casual notice, consistent enough to be unmistakable under scrutiny. A private catering arrangement billed to the restaurant, but delivered to personal addresses. Staffing costs for hours that didn't correspond to the schedule. The kind of thing that required access, authority, and the confidence of someone who believed she was the most watchful person in the room. Richard's HR director presented Diane with the documentation. Richard sat across from her and asked her to explain the discrepancies. He told me later that she was composed for longer than he expected she was, in all things, composed for longer than most people expected. But the documentation was thorough, and there were several items that she could not explain, and eventually the composure gave way to something else. She did not confess immediately. She did not confess that night at all, but she did not deny in a way that could be sustained either. Marcus was quiet at our table for a long time after the HR director came out and asked to speak with him. I didn't push him. I refilled both our water glasses from the pitcher the server had left. The restaurant had quieted to its late evening register, the deep booth conversations, the drift of low music, the occasional sound of a glass. Finally, Marcus said, "How long have you known?" I told him the rough timeline. The observations, the yellow legal pad, the call to Patricia. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I told him I needed to understand it fully before I said anything, that I needed documentation, not suspicion, that I'd seen what happened when families divided over accusations rather than evidence. He was quiet again. He said, "The kids' shoes." I said yes. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked like someone who had been carrying a weight he hadn't known was there and had set it down and was not yet sure what to do with his hands. He said, "I kept telling myself it was just how things were, that we were stretched, that it would get better when the project wrapped." I told him that was a reasonable thing to believe when you trusted someone. He looked out the window at the river. He said, "Sophie asked me last week why Grandpa buys her nicer things than we do." I said that sounded like Sophie. He almost smiled. She said it very matter-of-factly, like she was just doing a survey. We sat there while the restaurant moved around us. At some point, the server brought a small dessert that no one had ordered, chocolate, delicate. The kind of thing that appears when a restaurant is trying to express something without language. Diane and Marcus did not separate that night. I want to say that clearly because I think people assume a story like this ends one particular way, and the truth is more complicated and more honest. What happened over the following months was not a clean resolution. It was the kind of work that marriages either survive or don't, the kind that requires both people to look at things they'd rather not look at, to say things that feel like swallowing glass, to choose, again and again, the harder and more revealing conversation over the easier and more comfortable silence. Marcus got them into counseling within 2 weeks. A therapist in Lincoln Park, who specialized in exactly this kind of fracture, the specific damage done when financial deception and family trust collapse simultaneously. I know this because Marcus told me, and because he asked me, carefully, to stay patient. I told him patience was not a problem. Diane resigned from Carrington House. Richard's team reached an arrangement that I was not party to restitution, confidentiality, the mechanics of accountability that look different when a company decides on resolution rather than prosecution. I don't know the exact terms. I know they were not trivial. I also know, because Richard told me with a certain quiet satisfaction, that the regional manager, who had been ignoring the indicators for 14 months, was also asked to find other opportunities. Carrington House got a new floor manager, and Richard told me the first quarter under the new management was the cleanest operationally that the property had seen in 3 years. The following months were not easy ones. Marcus and Diane had hard conversations. Some of them happened at my kitchen table, which I had not expected, but which I accommodated because the table was there and the coffee was hot, and sometimes people need a neutral room. Diane said things to me one evening in March that I think cost her something real to say. She said she didn't know when she had started thinking the rules didn't apply to her. She said she'd spent so long managing the image of the restaurant, the presentation, the calibration, the careful maintenance of a certain impression that she'd lost the ability to see herself from the outside. She said she was sorry for what she'd said in January. Not sorry in the way people say it, when they want to end a conversation, but sorry in the way that means they've looked at something directly, and it changed the shape of what they understood. I told her that I believed her. I told her that I had not done what I did to hurt her, or to humiliate her. I told her I had done it because my grandchildren's shoes had water coming in through the soles, and because I'd spent 30 years building something, and then watched it get small, and then watched my wife die. And the only thing that still felt like it mattered was those two kids taking the train into the city and pressing their faces against the window. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "She talks about you constantly, you know, Sophie. She tells Owen things about you like you're a character in one of her books." I told her I considered that a very high honor. By May, Sophie had a new coat, blue this time, her choice, with yellow buttons that she informed me were the good kind of yellow, not the bad kind. Owen had new sneakers and also a rain jacket with dinosaurs on it that I had not purchased, but which he wore to show me with the solemnity of someone displaying significant new armor. I went to Sophie's school play, where she played a tree, a large tree, she specified, not a small one with a commitment to stillness that I found both impressive and characteristic. Marcus sat next to me in the auditorium, and at one point, during a particularly intense scene involving the small tree and a stage wind machine, he leaned over and said quietly, "Dad, thank you." And I said, "You're welcome." And neither of us said anything else, because the tree was entering an important moment and demanded our attention. I still have the yellow legal pad. I don't add to it anymore. I keep it in the kitchen drawer under the dish towels, next to the notepad where I write grocery lists and the small calendar I use to track the afternoons with Sophie and Owen. Sometimes when I'm looking for the grocery list, I'll pull it out by accident and see a page of my own handwriting, the careful notations of a man who was paying attention, and I'll put it back. Carol would have handled the whole thing differently. She would have seen it sooner, named it more directly, and found a way to address it that would have looked like conversation from the outside and felt like surgery from the inside. She had a capacity for confronting difficult things with grace that I've spent decades attempting to emulate and never quite managed. But I did what I could with the tools I had: patience, documentation, and a phone call to an old friend in the right business. The soup is usually hot now when I eat it. I remember to come back for it. Last Friday, I picked up Sophie and Owen from school, and we took the train into the city, and Owen pressed his face against the window, and Sophie read to him, and we went to the Italian place with the red checked tablecloths. Owen got the pasta with butter and ate until he was silent. Sophie told the owner it was not her birthday, but that she would be turning 8 in 7 weeks, and was it possible to go ahead and put her name on the board now? The owner looked at me. I shrugged. He wrote her name in purple chalk, because she told him that was the correct color, and she stood in front of it for a long time, with the expression of someone reading something very important, and then she turned around, satisfied, ready for whatever came next. So was I.